At the most basic level of human intelligence, there is no deep reflection, nor the need to understand the world in abstract terms. Here, the mind functions as a survival tool. Primary intelligence focuses on responding to immediate stimuli, hunger, fear, pleasure, pain. There is no analysis, only reaction. The body commands, the mind obeys. People who move primarily at this level perceive reality through the senses. What is seen, heard, or touched is the only thing that exists. There is no interest in invisible causes or long-term consequences. The present completely dominates the experience. Life is lived moment to moment, without an internal narrative connecting the past to the future. At the second level, concrete intelligence, a slight evolution appears. It is no longer just about reacting, but about learning through direct experience. The person understands that certain actions produce certain results. If I work, I get money. If I follow simple rules, I avoid trouble. Thinking remains literal and practical, deeply tied to the tangible. At this point, many manual and technical skills flourish. Masons, mechanics, artisans, and practical workers often stand out here. They do not need complex theories to be effective. Their intelligence is expressed in action, in doing things well with their hands, in mastering repetitive processes with precision. For them, intelligence is not something to be discussed, but something to be demonstrated. However, these levels also have a clear limit. Abstract ideas, philosophical concepts, or existential questions become unnecessary or even annoying. Thinking too much is perceived as a waste of time. The world is simple. It works or it doesn't. It is useful or it isn't. The most important thing is to understand that these levels are not inferior in human terms. They are essential. Without them, society could not sustain itself. But they also explain why many people never feel the need to question their way of seeing reality. For them, the world already makes sense as it is, and it is precisely here that the great invisible divide between different levels of intelligence begins. At the third level, intelligence stops focusing solely on survival or immediate utility and begins to orient itself toward coexistence. Here, the mind learns to read the social environment, to interpret norms, hierarchies, and collective expectations. The question is no longer just what works, but what is allowed, and what do others expect of me? People who operate primarily at this level understand the value of social adaptation. They know how to behave, fit in, and respect implicit rules. Authority, tradition, and established structures carry enormous weight. What is right is defined by consensus, not by individual reflection. If the majority accepts it, then it is valid. At this point, a strong need for belonging arises. The group becomes a central reference for defining identity. Profession, status, reputation, and social role are key elements. Intelligence is manifested in the ability to navigate human relationships, avoid unnecessary conflict, and maintain a consistent image before others. This level explains why many people are highly competent in corporate, institutional, or bureaucratic environments. They know how to follow procedures, respect hierarchies, and communicate appropriately according to the context. They do not seek to break the system, but to function well within it. However, this very strength is also its limit. Deep critical thinking does not yet appear. Questioning norms can generate anxiety because it threatens the social stability they value so much. Disruptive ideas are often perceived as dangerous or irresponsible. Thinking differently implies the risk of being isolated. Therefore, at this level, intelligence is closely linked to conformity. It is not a lack of capacity, but an unconscious choice. The security of the group is more important than individual exploration. The world works better when everyone knows their place. But when someone begins to ask questions that go beyond what is socially accepted, when the why starts to weigh more than, this is how it's done, then the mind is ready to cross a much more uncomfortable threshold. At the fourth level, intelligence begins to clearly separate itself from the group. Here, a silent but profound rupture appears. The mind no longer accepts norms just because they exist. An uncomfortable, almost dangerous question arises. Does this really make sense? People at this level develop a strong capacity for analysis. They compare ideas, detect contradictions, and evaluate information more rationally. Tradition or authority is no longer enough. Truth begins to be measured by logical consistency, evidence, and results, not by social acceptance. This is the level where scientists, engineers, strategists, and technical thinkers flourish. Intelligence is expressed in the ability to solve complex problems, decompose systems, and find hidden patterns. The world becomes a set of variables that can be understood, optimized, or corrected. But this advancement comes at a psychological cost. As thinking becomes more independent, it also becomes lonelier. The person begins to notice that many social rules are arbitrary, that many collective beliefs do not withstand deep analysis. This creates distance from the environment. Here skepticism is born. Not everything is true just because it is repeated many times. Not all authority deserves automatic obedience. However, this stance can generate constant friction with those who still operate at previous levels. Questioning is seen as rebellion, coldness, or arrogance. Furthermore, although critical thinking is powerful, it still has limits. The analytical mind tends to rely excessively on logic and data, ignoring subtler dimensions of the human experience. Emotions, intuition, and deep meaning are often relegated. Therefore, many people get stuck at this level. They are brilliant, rational, and efficient, but they feel a void that is difficult to explain. They have learned to understand the world, but not necessarily to understand themselves. Something is missing, though they don't know exactly what. When logic no longer answers all the questions, when analysis fails to fill that internal void, intelligence is forced to evolve once more. At this level, intelligence takes a decisive turn. It no longer focuses solely on understanding the outer world, but on exploring the inner universe. A new, quieter, but much deeper question appears. Why do I think, feel, and react this way? People who reach this level begin to observe their emotions with distance. Instead of being dragged along by anger, fear, or anxiety, they learn to recognize them, name them, and understand their origin. Intelligence stops being just analysis and becomes self-awareness. Here, real empathy develops, not as a simple social skill, but as a deep understanding of the other. It is recognized that each person acts from their own wounds, fears, and conditioning. Judgment weakens, and in its place, understanding emerges. This level allows for handling conflicts in a more mature way. The person no longer needs to win every argument or impose their point of view. They learn to listen, to yield when necessary, and to choose their battles carefully. Intelligence is expressed in self-control. However, this stage can also be painful. By looking inward, traumas, insecurities, and repetitive patterns that were previously hidden come to light. Awareness expands, but with it comes greater emotional sensitivity. Many people feel vulnerable at this point. They understand more, feel more, and paradoxically also suffer more. They realize that not everything can be solved with logic or effort. There are wounds that can only be accepted and worked through with patience. This level marks a crucial transition. Intelligence no longer seeks only efficiency or external success. It begins to seek balance, meaning, and internal consistency. And when the person understands that even their emotions do not define who they are, the door opens to an even deeper level. At this level, intelligence stops chasing quick answers. The mind no longer runs, it stops. A question appears that does not seek an immediate solution, but understanding. What am I here for? People who reach this level begin to perceive life as a broader process. They understand that success, failure, pain, and joy are not opposites, but parts of the same experience. Intelligence is transformed into contemplation. Here, a different relationship with time emerges. The past stops being a constant burden, and the future no longer generates as much anxiety. Attention is anchored in the present, not as a technique, but as a natural way of being in the world. This level brings a particular calm. It is not euphoria or indifference, but a serenity born of accepting uncertainty. The person understands that not everything has a clear explanation and learns to live with the unknown without feeling lost. A change also appears in the way of relating to others. The need for external approval is reduced. Comparisons lose their power. Identity no longer depends so much on social roles, titles, or visible achievements. However, this level can cause a sense of isolation, not because the person pulls away from others, but because they start to see the world from a different perspective. Many conversations feel superficial, many concerns of others seem irrelevant. At this point, intelligence does not seek to impose truths. It understands that each person is at a different level of consciousness and that forcing others to awaken only generates resistance. Silence begins to have more value than words. This level is not the end, but a threshold. Those who cross it begin to intuit that the highest intelligence does not consist of knowing more, but of identifying less with the mind. And that understanding prepares the ground for the last level. At this final level, intelligence stops identifying with the self. Personality does not disappear, but the illusion that one is only their thoughts, emotions, or past stories is broken. The mind continues to function, but it no longer rules. People who reach this level understand something fundamental. Much of human suffering is born from excessive identification with the ego, from the need to be right, to defend an image, to control how others perceive us. Here a profound freedom arises. There is no longer a constant struggle to prove worth. Inner silence becomes more frequent than mental noise. The person acts with clarity, but without the urgency of external validation. This level does not imply withdrawing from the world. On the contrary, many become more present, more human, more compassionate. But their compassion is not born of sacrifice, but of understanding. They understand that everyone, to varying degrees, is trapped in their own internal narratives. Transcendent intelligence allows for observing intense emotions without being swept away by them. Fear appears, but it does not paralyze. Sadness arrives, but it does not define identity. Even pain is experienced without turning into prolonged suffering. At this point, life stops being a race and becomes an experience. Each moment is lived with full attention, without the obsession of getting somewhere. Meaning is no longer sought, it is perceived in the simple. However, this level is not common, not because it is superior, but because it requires letting go of many certainties. It requires accepting that not everything must be understood intellectually. And that is uncomfortable for a mind accustomed to control. Those who arrive here do not feel special. In fact, they often feel smaller in the face of the vastness of existence. But that humility is not weakness, it is clarity. This is the point where intelligence stops accumulating and starts releasing, where thought becomes a tool, not a prison, and where silence finally speaks more than any answer. Throughout these levels, one thing becomes clear. Not everyone travels the same mental path or at the same pace, and that is not a mistake. It is a natural consequence of how each individual faces life, pain, and uncertainty. Some remain at levels where reaction dominates over reflection. Others move slowly, questioning their beliefs, facing internal contradictions, learning to observe before responding. And a few come to understand that true intelligence does not consist of accumulating answers, but of living with the questions. It is not about classifying people as superior or inferior. Each level serves a function. Each stage offers different lessons. The problem arises when someone gets stuck at one level believing there is nothing more to discover. Most human conflicts are not born from a lack of knowledge, but from mental rigidity, from the inability to accept other perspectives, from the constant need to be right to protect a fragile identity. Understanding these levels is not for judging others, but for observing ourselves, to ask ourselves from where we react, from where we decide, from where we interpret the world. Perhaps the real question is not what level you're at now, but if you are willing to move, if you have the courage to question what you always took for granted, if you can tolerate silence when there are no immediate answers, because in the end, intelligence is not a goal that is reached. It is a continuous process of detachment, awareness, and humility, and that process never ends.